The moment my nephew caught me in the middle of the act was the trigger of something I will never forget. It all started on a quiet afternoon, one of those lazy days when the house felt more like a sanctuary than a space for living. The golden sunlight poured through the blinds, striping the walls and furniture with soft, dappled light. Outside, a gentle breeze nudged the branches of the oak tree in the yard, and the faint hum of distant traffic lulled the house into a dreamlike stillness. I'd been alone for a few hours now. My nephew Evan had stepped out to run some errands, a quick trip to the grocery store he'd told me before leaving. It wasn't unusual for him to help around the house while he stayed with me. He was always reliable, always ready to lend a hand. I appreciated the company he brought, but I also treasured moments like this solitude. I sat on the couch for a while, flicking through the channels on the TV, though nothing held my attention. My mind wandered aimlessly, and a strange restlessness began to simmer under my skin. I sighed, stretching my arms as if trying to shake the feeling off, but it clung to me like humidity. Eventually, I got up and began walking through the house, hoping that movement would ease the tension. That's when I wandered into the bedroom. It was an innocent enough decision at first, just another room, another place to exist for a while. The bedroom had always been my retreat, a cozy, familiar space where I could shed the weight of the day. The soft duve, the faint smell of lavender from the pillowcases, and the dim light filtering through the curtains made it feel like an embrace. I sat on the edge of the bed, my fingers grazing the comforter as I stared out the window. The quiet crept back in, wrapping around me like a heavy blanket. But instead of comforting me, it sparked something else, an urge faint at first, like the distant roll of thunder. It wasn't something I thought about often, not when life was full of distractions, but here in the stillness it surfaced. I exhaled as if trying to release it, but the feeling only grew stronger. My skin tinged with a warmth that had nothing to do with the sunlit room, and I shifted on the bed. My heart began to beat a little faster, my breaths growing unsteady as my mind drifted to thoughts. I shouldn't have been having thoughts that made the warmth spread deeper, winding its way through my chest and down to my stomach. I ran my hands slowly down my thighs over the fabric of my leggings, then back up again. A shiver traveled through me and I swallowed hard. It was as if my own touch had flipped a switch, and suddenly the rest of the world no longer existed. The house didn't exist. Time didn't exist. There was only me, the bed, and the quiet pulse of my heart hammering in my ears. I let my fingers wander, brushing over the curve of my waist, my sides lingering at the edge of my shirt. I closed my eyes as I leaned back against the pillows, my breaths now shallow, uneven. I knew I shouldn't let myself go. Evan could be back any minute, but the thought only heightened the thrill. I'd been so composed for so long, so restrained. Giving in felt exhilarating, like tipping over the edge of a cliff and letting the wind catch me. My hands moved more freely, now exploring the familiar landscape of my body with a tenderness I hadn't allowed myself in far too long. A soft sigh escaped my lips as warmth pooled in the pit of my stomach. My imagination took over, weaving scenes that only intensified the sensations. The faint memory of lips grazing my neck, hands pulling me close, whispered words that once made my skin prickle. My heartbeat quickened, and I arched my back slightly, my senses alight. I didn't hear the front door open. The sound of footsteps, soft at first, crept into my awareness, but I was too far gone to react. It wasn't until Evan's voice rang through the hallway that my eyes flew open, panic snapping me back to reality like ice. Water splashed across my skin. "Aunt, I'm back." The sound of grocery bags rustling followed his voice, and I froze. My body tensed mid-motion. My breath caught in my throat as I turned my head sharply toward the bedroom door. It was open, wide, open for half a second. I thought I could recover. Maybe he hadn't seen me yet. Maybe the angle wasn't right, but then his footsteps stopped. I knew instinctively that he was there, that he'd seen me, my cheeks, flames as my heart pounded in my chest, a mix of adrenaline and embarrassment coursing through my veins. I didn't move. I couldn't move. It was as if my body had forgotten how to respond, leaving me sprawled on the bed, frozen like a deer, caught in headlights. Evan stood in the doorway, grocery bag still dangling from his hands, his expression frozen in shock. His wide eyes met mine, and for a moment time seemed to slow. I could see the realization flicker across his face as he tried to process what he was seeing. I wanted to speak, to say something that would break the unbearable silence hanging between us, but nothing came. My throat felt tight, as though the words had been locked away, leaving me mute. Finally, Evan blinked, his voice barely above a whisper. I didn't mean to. His words were rushed, stumbled, as if he couldn't find the right ones. He took a step back, almost as if he wanted to erase the moment, but his gaze lingered on me, his expression shifting. And that was when I saw it. Something beyond the shock, beyond the awkwardness of catching someone in such an intimate act. It was curiosity, a flicker of intrigue, quickly hidden behind a veil of discomfort. The air between us grew heavier, suffocating in its silence. I didn't know what to do. Should I cover myself? Should I say something, apologize, or maybe invite him in because I was still that excited? But before I could decide, Evan cleared his throat, looking anywhere but at me. I'll put these away. His voice wavered as he gestured to the bags in his hands. Sorry, Aunt. I'll give you space. With that, he turned abruptly, his footsteps retreating down the hallway, leaving me alone once more. I wanted to ask him to take over, but he is my nephew. I couldn't not yet. I sat up slowly, my body still tingling, though the thrill had been replaced with something else, something I couldn't quite name. My cheeks burned as I replayed what had just happened, my heart still pounding in my chest. And yet, even as I tried to process it, part of me couldn't shake the image of Evan standing there, his gaze lingering just a moment too long before he turned away. The silence that followed Evan's retreat was deafening. My breaths were shallow, uneven, and I could still feel the blood rushing to my face. I sat on the bed, my hands gripping the comforter tightly. As I tried to process what had just happened, he saw me, the words echoed in my mind over and over again, like a taunting refrain. I couldn't escape. I wanted to bury my face in my hands to erase the moment entirely, but I couldn't. My body still hummed with the remnants of the sensations. I'd been lost in a stark contrast to the embarrassment, now knotting itself tightly in my chest. And to be honest, in some way, it excited me that he had seen it, opening a door to fill the void I had. But as he is my nephew, I just couldn't. I glanced at the door, now closed. He'd left quickly, almost too quickly, and yet his expression lingered in my mind, the mixture of shock, curiosity, and something else I couldn't quite define. My heart raced again, this time for reasons far more complicated than before. Slowly, I swung my legs off the bed, grounding myself on the floor as if it could anchor my swirling thoughts. I stood up and smoothed my shirt, trying to compose myself, though no one was there to see me. The house felt different now, the once comforting stillness replaced by a tension that lingered in the air, refusing to dissipate. I knew I couldn't hide in the bedroom forever. Evan was still here, and pretending nothing had happened wouldn't make it go away. The very thought of facing him, of looking him in the eye after what he'd seen, sent a shiver of nervous energy through me. But I couldn't ignore him either. Taking a steadying breath, I stepped out of the bedroom and into the hallway. The faint sounds of cabinets opening and closing drifted from the kitchen. Evan was putting the groceries away, just like he'd said. I hesitated for a moment, hovering in the hallway, debating whether to turn back. But the longer I stood there, the more ridiculous I felt. Just act normal. I repeated the thought, like a mantra, as I made my way toward the kitchen. The closer I got, the more my nerves buzzed, as if my body could sense his presence, before I even saw him. Evan stood at the counter, his back turned to me as he unpacked a bag of produce. His movements were slower than usual, almost deliberate, and I wondered if he was stalling, buying time to avoid me. I swallowed hard and cleared my throat softly to announce my presence. He stiffened slightly but turned to face me, his expression carefully neutral. "Oh, hey," he said, his voice casual, though I could hear the underlying tension. "I just finished putting the groceries away." "Thanks," I replied, my voice quieter than I intended. I stepped closer, leaning against the opposite counter for support. The distance between us felt far more significant than the space of a small kitchen. I was still a bit excited, so I knew I had to hold my distance. Evan busied himself with placing a carton of eggs into the fridge, avoiding my gaze. I watched him for a moment. Dang it. Why was he so handsome? All of a sudden, I wanted to say something, anything to break the silence. But what could I possibly say? Finally, Evan spoke, though he kept his eyes on the fridge. "Sorry about earlier. I didn't mean to, walk in." I felt my cheeks flush again and I crossed my arms over my chest, a futile attempt to shield myself from the memory. "It's fine," I said quickly, though my voice betrayed me a little too high-pitched to sound convincing. Evan at the fridge door and turned to face me fully. This time his eyes met mine and I felt my breath catch. There was no longer any trace of embarrassment or shock in his expression, only a kind of quiet curiosity that made my skin tingle. "I didn't mean to make you uncomfortable," he added, his voice softer. Now I was just surprised. "That's all I know," I said, my gaze dropping to the floor. It was my fault. I should have been more careful. We both fell silent again, though this time it didn't feel as suffocating. Instead, there was an odd energy in the air, like something unspoken hung between us, waiting to be acknowledged. Evan shifted on his feet, his hands sliding into his pockets. "I guess I just never thought of you like that," he said. After a pause, his words careful, deliberate. My head shot up, my heart skipping a beat at his admission, like what his eyes held, mine unwavering. "I mean, you're always so put together, so composed." He hesitated as if searching for the right words. It just caught me off guard. That's all. I felt the heat rise to my cheeks again, though this time it wasn't entirely from embarrassment. There was something about the way he looked at me now, something different, something I couldn't quite name. It sent a ripple through me, unsettling and thrilling all at once. "I guess I'm not as composed as you thought," I said quietly, my lips curving into the faintest of smiles. Evan's expression softened, and for the first time since he'd walked in on me, the tension seemed to ease just slightly. "It's not a bad thing," he said, his voice low, almost thoughtful. For a moment, we just stood there, the silence between us no longer awkward but charged with something unspoken. I didn't know what to make of it, of him, of the way he was looking at me, but I didn't want to look away. Finally, Evan broke the silence, his tone returning to its usual casual self, though I could hear the slight edge to it. "I was thinking of making dinner soon, if you're hungry." I exhaled, realizing I'd been holding my breath. "Yeah, that sounds good." He nodded, a small smile, tugging at the corner of his lips. "Okay, I'll start in a bit." I watched as he turned back toward the counter, buying himself with arranging the groceries. But I couldn't shake the feeling that something had shifted between us. I lingered in the kitchen for a moment longer. My arms still crossed over my chest as I watched him. My thoughts were a tangled mess, the memory of what had happened, replaying in my mind over and over again. But this time it wasn't just the embarrassment that lingered. It was the way he'd looked at me, and I couldn't help but wonder if somehow he was thinking the same thing. The kitchen filled with the soft sounds of chopping and the faint sizzle of oil in a pan. I sat at the small table watching Evan work as he prepared dinner. His movements were precise and unhurried, as if he was forcing himself to focus on the task at hand to block out everything else. I understood my own thoughts were a storm. I couldn't quiet, swirling around the moment we both seemed determined not to talk about. I studied him as he stood at the stove, his brow furrowed in concentration. His dark hair fell slightly over his forehead, and the sleeves of his shirt were pushed up, revealing forearms that flexed subtly as he stirred. It was a strange thing, really, how quickly the dynamic between us had shifted hours ago. We'd been the same as always, Nephew, coexisting comfortably in the house we shared now. Now it felt like we were walking a tightrope, careful not to acknowledge the very thing that had brought us here. And yet the silence between us wasn't uncomfortable. If anything, it hummed with an energy I didn't quite know how to define. I tried to distract myself, focusing on the faint sound of the knife against the cutting board. But my mind kept drifting back to the way he'd looked at me earlier, to the unspoken words that had lingered between us in the kitchen. I shifted in my seat, my cheeks warming as the memory surfaced again. Why can't I let it go? You're quiet, Evan said, suddenly, his voice cutting through my thoughts. He glanced over his shoulder at me, his eyes catching mine for just a moment before returning to the stove. I forced a small smile, just tired. I guess he didn't reply right away, but I noticed the way his shoulders tensed slightly, as if he didn't believe me. I can make you tea if you want, he offered. That's sweet, but I'm fine, sweetie. My voice came out softer than I intended, and for some reason the words seemed to hang in the air, heavy and lingering. Evan turned back to his cooking, but I could feel the tension building again, coiling tighter and tighter between us. It wasn't just me. I knew he felt it too. I could see it in the way his movements slowed, in the way he seemed hyper-aware of my presence behind him. Finally unable to bear the silence any longer. I rose from the table and crossed the small kitchen to stand beside him. Eat any help? I asked, my voice, light casual, as if I could force everything back to normal by sheer will. Evan looked at me surprised, and for a moment I thought he might refuse. But then his lips curved into a faint smile, and he nodded toward the cutting board. You can chop the garlic if you want. I grabbed a knife and slid the small cloves onto the board. The task gave me something to focus on, a welcome distraction from the way his presence made my skin feel too warm. For a few minutes, we worked side by side in silence, the only sounds, the rhythmic chopping of the knife and the quiet bubbling of the sauce on the stove. But even then, I couldn't ignore the awareness I felt of him, of the space between us that suddenly felt far too small every time he moved closer, reaching for a spoon or a towel. My breath hitched just slightly, my heart stuttering in my chest, and each time I wondered if he noticed it too. At one point, his arm brushed against mine as he reached for a bottle of seasoning. It was a fleeting touch, barely more than a whisper of skin against skin. But it sent a jolt through me as if I'd touched something electric. I froze for half a second, the knife hovering above the garlic, and glanced up at him. Evan didn't look at me, didn't say anything, but I saw the way his jaw tensed, the way his hand lingered on the bottle, just a moment too long. I exhaled slowly and returned to my task, forcing myself to focus on the steady rhythm of the knife against the cutting board. But the pulse of heat running through me wouldn't fade, no matter how hard I tried to ignore it. Smells good, I said, finally my voice breaking the silence. Evan glanced at me, and for a moment I thought I saw something flicker in his expression, something unreadable. But then he smiled, soft and boyish, as if nothing at all had changed. It's your recipe. I'm just following it. His words caught me off guard, though I wasn't sure why. I smiled back, and for a moment the tension seemed to ease, replaced by something gentler. You're doing a good job, I replied, and I meant it. There was something calming about the way Evan worked in the kitchen, his movements smooth and confident. I'd always known him as a reliable, thoughtful young man, but now I found myself noticing things I hadn't before, the curve of his smile, the way his eyes crinkle slightly at the corners, the warmth of his voice when he spoke, and the realization unsettled me. I turned back to the garlic, focusing on chopping it finer than necessary, but I could still feel his presence beside me, too close, and yet not close enough. It was maddening the way my body responded to him, the way my thoughts refused to behave. I'd always seen him as my nephew, as family, so why did this feel so different? When the sauce was finally ready, Evan turned off the stove and reached for the bowls stacked beside the sink. Dinner's ready, he said, his voice breaking the stillness. I nodded and began clearing the cutting board, eager for something to do, anything to keep myself busy. But as I reached for the dishes, my hand brushed against his, and we both froze for a heartbeat. Neither of us moved. I looked up at him, my breath catching as our eyes met. His expression was unreadable, but there was something in the way he looked at me, something intense, something that made my chest tighten. "Sorry," I murmured, pulling my hand back quickly. Evan didn't respond right away. He just stood there watching me, his gaze steady and searching. And then finally he shook his head, a small smile tugging at the corner of his lips. "It's okay." He turned back to the bowls, but my heart was still racing, my thoughts spiraling out of control. I didn't know what was happening between us, if anything was happening at all, but I couldn't ignore it anymore. The tension was there, undeniable and heavy, and no matter how hard I tried, I couldn't push it away. We ate dinner at the small kitchen table, the clink of cutlery against ceramic plates filling the silence between us. The meal was good. Evan had done a perfect job with the sauce, but I could hardly taste it. My mind was a swirl of contradictions, one thought colliding into the next as I tried to make sense of the tension. Sitting heavy between us, Evan sat across from me, his head slightly lowered as he focused on his plate. Every so often, though, he would glance up just for a moment, as if checking to see if I was looking at him. And every time our eyes met, my pulse quickened, my stomach fluttering as I hurriedly looked away. I tried to focus on my food, on the simplicity of chewing and swallowing, but it was impossible to ignore the awareness that crackled like electricity between us. It was ridiculous. I told myself, he's your nephew, family. But the thought did little to quiet the heat pooling low in my stomach. "Dinner's great," I said, finally, just to break the silence. My voice was steadier than I expected, though I could still feel the edge of tension in it. Evan looked up, a faint smile pulling at his lips. "Thanks, like I said, it's your recipe. I just followed it. You did more than that. You made it better." The words slipped out before I could stop them, and for a moment Evan just looked at me, his expression softening. The compliment hung in the air between us, heavier than it should have been, and I felt my cheeks warm under his gaze. "Thanks," he said quietly, his voice low, intimate. I busied myself with my plate again, pushing the food around. Even though I wasn't hungry anymore, the small table suddenly felt too small, the space between us shrinking with every glance, every unspoken word. When Evan finally finished eating, he set his fork down and leaned back in his chair, studying me carefully. "You okay?" His question caught me off guard, and I blinked up at him, trying to summon an answer that made sense. "Yeah, I'm fine." Evan tilted his head slightly, his gaze unwavering. "You don't seem fine." "I'm just tired, I guess," I replied. My voice quieter now. It wasn't a lie, not entirely. I was tired of the confusion, the tension, the strange, unshakable pull I felt whenever I looked at him. Evan didn't say anything right away, but I could see the way his expression shifted, softening with something that looked almost like understanding. "You've been quiet since earlier," he said, his voice low, careful. "I didn't mean to make you feel weird." "It's okay." I cut in, forcing a small smile. "Really, let's just forget about it." Evan's eyes held mine for a long moment, and I could see he didn't believe me, but he nodded anyway, as if agreeing to let it go for now. "Okay," he said finally. "If you say so." He stood and gathered his plate, taking it to the sink. I watched him for a moment, the way his shoulders tensed just slightly, the way he lingered as he turned on the water to rinse off the dishes. I knew he felt it too, that strange, unspoken tension that had hung between us since earlier. And no matter how much we tried to ignore it, to pretend it wasn't there, it lingered. I rose from the table and brought my plate to the sink as well, placing it beside his thanks for making dinner. I said softly, my voice just above a whisper. Evan turned to look at me, and for a moment neither of us said anything. His gaze was steady, searching, as if he was trying to figure out what I was thinking. I felt my breath catch in my throat, the air between us suddenly too thick, too heavy. "You're welcome," he murmured. Finally, his voice was quiet, but it held a weight that made my stomach twist. I turned away quickly, my hands trembling slightly as I wiped them on a towel. "Stop it. This is nothing," but the fluttering in my chest refused to settle. "I'm going to head to bed early," I said abruptly, my voice tight. I needed space, distance, anything to clear my head. Evan nodded, though his eyes lingered on me as I turned to leave the kitchen. "Good night," he said softly. "Good night," I replied without looking back, my footsteps echoing softly in the hallway as I retreated to my room. Once inside, I closed the door and leaned against it, exhaling shakily. My heart was still racing, my thoughts a tangled mess. I couldn't untangle, no matter how hard I tried. I pressed my palms against my cheeks, feeling the heat that hadn't faded since dinner. "This isn't normal," I told myself, pacing across the room. I tried to make sense of what was happening, of why my body seemed to betray me every time Evan looked at me. He was my nephew. I'd known him for years. Oh, why did it feel like everything had shifted? I sank onto the edge of the bed, my head in my hands. The memory of earlier that afternoon played on a loop in my mind. The moment he'd seen me, the look in his eyes, the way his expression had flickered with something beyond shock. I couldn't stop thinking about it, about the way my own body had responded to being caught, to being seen. A shiver ran through me, and I let out a frustrated sigh. This was ridiculous. I was overthinking, reading too much into things that didn't mean anything. That's what I told myself anyway. But deep down, I wasn't sure I believed it. The house had gone quiet again, save for the faint sound of the wind rustling the trees outside. I sat there for a long time, staring at the floor, my thoughts a blur of confusion and longing and something I couldn't quite name. And then faintly I heard footsteps in the hallway. They stopped outside my door, and for a moment everything went still. My breath caught in my throat and stared at the door, half expecting it to open, but it didn't. The footsteps lingered for only a moment before retreating down the hall again, growing fainter and fainter until the house was silent once more. I exhaled shakily, my chest tight as I sat there unmoving. Part of me wanted to go after him, to say something to end this strange tension that had built between us. But I couldn't bring myself to move. Instead, I stayed where I was, the silence pressing in on me as I tried to ignore the way my body still hummed with the memory of his gaze. And as I lay on my bed staring up at the ceiling, the faint glow of the moon casting soft light across the room, my body felt tense, my thoughts refusing to quiet. Every sound, the creak of the house settling the hum of the refrigerator from the kitchen, seemed amplified in the silence, and no matter how hard I tried, I couldn't forget the footsteps outside my door. I turned over, pressing my face into the pillow, trying to will myself to sleep, but my body betrayed me, my skin tinged with an awareness I didn't want to admit, and my mind drifted back to Evan, to his eyes on mine, to the unspoken energy that had lingered between us since dinner. It was wrong. I knew it was wrong, but that didn't stop the warmth that spread through me, curling low in my stomach like a fire I couldn't extinguish. I exhaled shakily and sat up, my legs dangling off the edge of the bed. The faint ache in my chest wouldn't go away, and no matter how much I told myself it was nothing, I couldn't shake the feeling that everything had changed. The way he looked at me, the way I couldn't stop looking at him. "I need water," I told myself, as if that would solve anything. The excuse was flimsy, but it gave me a reason to move, to do something other than say, "Here," and let my thoughts eat me alive. I padded quietly into the hallway, the floor cool beneath my bare feet. The house was dark, save for the faint glow of the kitchen light. I hesitated for a moment, the memory of earlier flooding back, the way Evan's gaze had lingered on me, the way my own body had responded. I shook the thought away and forced myself forward. The kitchen was empty. Just as I'd expected, I moved to the cabinet and grabbed a glass, filling it from the tap. The cold water helped, at least for a moment, cooling the heat that lingered under my skin. But just as I turned to leave, I froze. Evan was standing in the doorway. I hadn't heard him come in, but there he was, his silhouette, framed by the faint light spilling in from the hallway. He didn't say anything, didn't move, just stood there watching me. His expression, unreadable. Couldn't sleep. I asked softly, my voice breaking the silence. Evan shook his head, stepping into the kitchen. "No," he said, his voice low. He moved closer, his eyes never leaving mine. "You couldn't either." I swallowed hard, my fingers tightening around the glass in my hand. "No." He stopped just a few feet away, the air between us growing heavy again. I could feel my pulse racing, my skin pickling with awareness at his proximity. Neither of us spoke, and yet so much was being said in the silence. Evan's gaze softened, though it held something deeper, something that made my chest tighten about earlier. He started his voice barely above a whisper. I shook my head quickly, cutting him off. "We don't need to talk about it, but maybe we should." His words hung in the air, heavy and unshakable. My breath caught, and I looked away, unable to hold his gaze. "It was a mistake," I said, though the words felt hollow even as I spoke them. "You shouldn't have seen that I shouldn't have." "It wasn't a mistake," Evan said, quietly stepping closer. His voice was steady, sure, and when I looked up at him, I saw it the same Poe that had been eating away at me all night, the same thing I didn't want to admit. I took a step back, my heart pounding. "Evan, this is wrong." He finished for me. His tone wasn't accusatory, just calm understanding, maybe, but you feel it too, don't you? I opened my mouth to protest, to tell him he was imagining things, but I couldn't. The words wouldn't come because they would have been a lie. The silence stretched between us again, but this time it felt different. He took another step toward me and I didn't move away. I couldn't. My feet felt rooted to the ground, my body betraying me as my heart raced. "Tell me to stop," Evan said softly, his voice barely above a whisper as he closed the space between us. "If you don't want this, tell me and I'll stop." I stared up at him, my breath shallow, my chest rising and falling. As the distance between us disappeared, his eyes searched mine, waiting for a word, a signal, anything. But I didn't say a word. I couldn't. Instead, I stayed there frozen as his hand reached out, his fingers brushing against my arm in a touch so soft it sent a shiver down my spine. My lips parted, but no sound came. "Say the word," he whispered again, his voice low, steady. I should have said something, I knew I should have, but I couldn't ignore the fire building inside me, the pull I felt toward him, the way my body leaned into his touch, despite everything I told myself. And then finally, I let myself go. I leaned forward just enough to close the space between us, my body trembling as his arm slid around me. I felt his warmth, his strength, and I melted against him, my head resting against his chest as I exhaled shakily for a moment. Neither of us moved. We just stood there, wrapped in the stillness of the kitchen, our breaths mingling in the quiet. My heart was pounding, and I knew his was too. "This isn't," I started to say, but the words caught in my throat. "I know," Evan murmured, his hand sliding up my back, his touch gentle, steady. "But it feels right." I looked up at him then, my gaze meeting his, and for the first time I didn't try to fight it. I didn't try to tell myself it was wrong, that I shouldn't want this. I just let it happen. Evan leaned down, his forehead resting against mine as his hands cradled my face. His touch was so tender it made my chest ache, and I felt the last of my resistance crumble. And then he kissed me. It was soft at first, tentative, as if testing the waters. But when I didn't pull away, the kiss deepened, his lips moving against mine with a hunger that matched my own. I felt my body press closer to his, my hands gripping his shirt as if holding on to something I'd been searching for all along. The kitchen disappeared. The world outside vanished. There was only him, only this moment, this connection, this fire that we couldn't deny any longer. We broke apart just long enough to catch our breath, our foreheads still touching as we stared at each other, the weight of everything unspoken hanging between us. "Are you sure?" Evan whispered, his voice barely audible. I didn't trust myself to speak, so I just nodded, my heart hammering in my chest. And in that quiet kitchen, under the soft glow of the moonlight, I let myself fall completely, surrendering to the pole that had been building between us all day. It wasn't right. I knew it wasn't right, but in that moment I didn't care. "Why don't you continue, Wit? Where you caught me at?" I asked. "May I?" he replied. I nodded and let him do his thing. It was amazing. It was crazy. "Wow," as I said, "I know this isn't right and I have not told anyone about it, but it is a memory of mine. I will always remember. I don't care what other people think of it." This was between me and my nephew Evan, a secret we shared until this point, telling my story to you. What do you think? Should I be ashamed? Or could I make even more memories like this with him? Let me know in the comments. Thank you.
Subscribe to my channel.